A stronger day, be your best every day. Hi, I'm Adimas, founder and director of Strength Optimizer. I aim to help you stay healthy, be happier, and deal with challenges with greater resilience. Is your workplace a place where you thrive and excel in what you do? Does your workplace support you to stay mentally fit and be your best every day? What can you do to thrive at your workplace? Today, you will meet Dr. Michelle McQuaid. Michelle will explain why workplace well-being matters and show you 4 simple ways of how you can thrive at your workplace. Thank you for watching. Good morning, everyone. My name is Adimas, and I'm the founder and director of Strength Optimizer. Thank you for watching Strength Optimizer, the Science Up Your Wellbeing series. Today, we have Dr. Michelle McQuaid joining us. Michelle is a best-selling author, workplace well-being teacher, and a Playful Change Activator. She lives to help people discover their strengths, move beyond their fears, and finally, to experience what it takes to flourish with confidence. It's so great that today, Shao, that you can spend some time with us. And I know that you are in Toronto. So how are you doing?
We're doing okay. Thank you for having us here. We are back in lockdown at the moment,
Right.
so our COVID numbers are around 1,900 a day.
Wow.
So we are working those resilience muscles that we have, and hopefully we will have a bit more freedom by the time Christmas comes around.
Absolutely, absolutely. So once again, thank you for taking some time out to share with us your insight and your work and your wisdom in the areas of workplace well-being. I know that, Shao, you are a well-being consultant, a speaker, a writer, a coach. So how do you actually describe yourself and what you do in less than, let's say, 5 minutes?
It's the million-dollar question, Adina. So, look, I think when I started out in this about a decade ago, it was my hope that we would be able to help people find practical ways to use the latest research to care for their well-being and to make that as accessible, affordable, and effective for as many people as possible.
Yep.
And that still really guides what I do and our team does every single day. How do we do that practically? We've learned that there are really 4 important things when it comes to trying to make that a reality, be it for me individually or for a team or for a whole organization. And the first is trying to help people have a shared language when it comes to talking about caring for their well-being. Most of us understand when you say, hey, you want to look at your well-being a little closer, or do you want some support on that? We get the essence of it, but once you start to dig behind, well, what does well-being mean for you? It tends to mean lots of different things to different people. And so the first step we find is really important is just getting some common language to be able to talk about our well-being, or otherwise it's kind of hard to move anything anywhere.
Yes.
The second thing we find super helpful then is to help people have some shared measures around how they're going to assess their well-being and what impact any of their efforts are having on it. The third is a shared toolbox of evidence-based practices, right? There are so many great ways that you can care for your well-being, and the science over the last 20 years has grown in leaps and bounds in this space. So what are the evidence-based practical ways that I can make tiny investments in my well-being each day? Because unfortunately, as you and I know, it does take each day. It's never that kind of one and done and we're all sorted. And then the last bit we find is having shared support, because even for those of us who have great willpower, very self-regulated, we know that caring for our well-being is not a solo adventure. We need other people to help pick us up when it's hard, cheer us on when it's working, to be able to ask the silly questions of when we're trying something that just doesn't seem to be having the impact that we thought it would. And so that last piece is shared support. So there's 4 ways we think about making that promise of well-being and caring for our well-being a reality: shared language, shared measures, shared tools, and shared support.
What a beautiful and practical, concise summary when it comes to well-being. And then I couldn't agree with you more when it comes to the word well-being. Obviously, as we use in many places and many different ways, but having a shared language means that we're creating a shared reality, a shared understanding. And then from then on to be able to know how am I going with my well-being through a set of measurement, practical measurement, tangible that we can see so that we have practical milestones that we can move forward, plus supporting by a series of evidence-based practical tools and strategies and surrounding ourselves with people who can cheer us on. I think that is definitely a very comprehensive sort of framework to help people or organizations or even community to thrive and to build their well-being. So thank you for sharing, Shell.
You're so welcome.
Yeah. And the other thing is that I know that you have worked with many local and global organizations to improve their workplace well-being, whether it's in the areas of resilience or performance. Maybe you can tell us or explain for us what is workplace well-being and why it matters.
Yeah, I love Professor Felicia Huppert's definition of well-being, which is that well-being is our ability to feel good. So it's that positive emotion, happiness kind of side we often associate with it, and to function effectively. And I think in workplaces, that part is often the piece that organisations are most willing to invest in well-being efforts for, because we want our people to be able to work effectively. Yeah. So Felicia says, well-being is our ability to feel good and function effectively. And I find that for many workplaces, wherever they're starting on their wellbeing journey, it's a really simple and accessible definition for anybody to wrap their heads around. Yeah. We've been researching, as you mentioned, wellbeing in workplaces all over the world for the last 5 years, particularly with the help of Dr. Peggy Kern from Melbourne University. And I think what we've discovered that we would add to Felicia's definition is Felicia's definition really helps us think about the levels of thriving. You know, are we high in thriving and well-being, or are we lower in thriving and well-being? And what impact is that having for us? What we've discovered in the research with Dr. Kern is that context also matters. And we've definitely seen that come to life as COVID has hit so many parts of the world during 2020. And so what we found is that that context element, we think about kind of measuring well-being on these two continua: thriving, am I high or low? But also struggle, am I high in struggle or am I low in struggle? Yeah. So I could be high in thriving and low in struggle. We often say, you know, these people are feeling on top of the world. They're consistently thriving, bless them. And for many of us, we might think, well, that's the ideal, right? How do I get all my people up to there? But we also find that you could be high in thriving and high in struggle. Okay. We don't define struggle as big or small, work or home, mental or physical. We just say struggle, you know, whatever that means for you right now in your context. And what we find is that actually there's an amazing group of people in most organisations who Peggy calls them your most resilient workers. We say they're living well despite struggle. Yeah. Then you can have workers who are low in struggle and they're low in thriving. We often call these, they're just getting by. You know, nothing's really wrong, but nothing's really great either. They're just getting by. And then we can be low in thriving and high in struggle. So down the bottom here, we talk about these workers as really struggling. Okay. And understanding where your workers are is quite important as an organisation to think about then the best way to support well-being, right? If we've got lots of resilient workers, what they might need is quite different from if we've got lots of workers who are kind of just getting by. Yep. But to your question about then, well, why might it matter which group my workers are in? What we've seen throughout 2020, we were fortunate in that we had measured the well-being of Australian workers, 1,000 workers, representative of the Australian workforce, in late November 2019. And life was pretty ordinary then. Yeah. We had then measured the well-being of another 1,000 workers, representative of the workforce. There was some overlap, but some new, in March 2020. So COVID was just starting to hit, but lockdowns hadn't happened. But Australia had been through major bushfires all across the country at that point. We then measured the well-being of another 1,000 workers, again, a bit of overlap between these groups, but not entirely, but in all cases representative of the Australian workforce by gender, by age, by location, all in full-time employment. And what we saw in August, mid-August, we measured again, of course, post-lockdowns all across Australia, and Victoria still in lockdown at that moment in time. And what we found is that for these workers who are consistently thriving, high in thriving, low in struggle, what we might think is the ideal, over the period of those 3 different measures, lots of shift happening in the context of those workers, this number of workers had halved. And where those workers gone, they hadn't so much gone over to be resilient. What had happened was there was a certain fragility about their ability to thrive, their high levels of thriving, and a struggle hit. What tended to happen was they dropped down to just getting by. It was like pre-COVID, they had great levels of well-being, but they were kind of swimming in the backyard, pool. It was all good. The environment was pretty controlled and contained. But suddenly something like COVID or other big shifts that could happen at work or at home for any of us occurred. And suddenly they found themselves trying to swim in the well-being ocean. And when they suddenly had to swim in the ocean, their ability, their levels of thriving dropped dramatically because they didn't feel able to navigate the new context in which they were required to care for their well-being. Our resilient workers, on the other hand, high in thriving, high in struggle, actually that number stayed pretty consistent throughout all those challenges. And what we see on the bottom line for workplaces, Demas, is that if you're in the top part of the thriving chart, you are likely to report significantly higher levels of engagement at work, job satisfaction, commitment to your organisation, and performance. All kind of bottom line things most workplaces are chasing. But of course, what happened was that for workplaces that had lots of these people who were high in thriving but low in struggle, suddenly a lot of that capacity dropped away during COVID as their workers suddenly showed a new level of fragility. Whereas when we had these resilient workers, they actually continued to be able to sustain the kind of performance that we were seeing pre-COVID levels. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is a very, not only insightful, but for me personally, reassuring kind of a finding, because sometimes I guess that stereotypically speaking, when we think about the word high level, the thriving or flourishing, a lot of us may think about, it is a pain-free, it is problem-free, it's always on top of the world all the time. But based on your research finding, it shows that, hey, we still can continue to thrive and flourish despite challenges, despite struggles. And it seems that in the context of pain or sometimes uncertainties like COVID, it's sort of not only boost up our individual level of resilience, but also equip us and prepare us for a greater level of adversity that's coming along the way as well.
And I think that's such an important point, Ademus, because we have also seen, both in our studies but other studies as well, for those workers who are really struggling, if you bring in a wellbeing program to your workplace and you've got quite a few workers really struggling, I mean, they are doing, it's all they can each day to get out of bed and get to work, right? And then when they get to work, it's like, we're all going to be well, let's thrive and flourish, right? I mean, it'd be enough to send you back to bed, right? But it certainly makes you feel perhaps more isolated and disconnected from your colleagues, and can also create a sense of shame about what's wrong with me, that I don't want to thrive and flourish, I just want to get by today. And so we actually see sometimes unintentionally our workplace wellbeing programs can do harm where we intended to do good, simply by not doing, as you're describing so beautifully, creating that permission that well-being comprises both thriving and struggle, and each are okay. Struggle is simply our body's way of letting us know, hey, there's an opportunity here for learning and growth, and it's going to need a bit more from you, rather than seeing struggle as signs that we're broken or that there's something missing in us in some way.
Yep, so wonderfully and beautifully explains. And I think that when we talk about, once again, struggling, it just, as you say, giving ourselves the permission to be compassionate towards ourselves, to acknowledge that trial and tribulations do happen, is how we go through that, whether it's with, as you mentioned earlier, with a group of people who can cheer us up, and to have this, I guess, that collective kind of well-being that we, at the end of the day, we are interconnected. We're not meant to be an island to say that if my level of happiness is all I pursue, I don't think that is, at least for me, a very concise definition of well-being.
Definitely.
That's good. That's good. So when it comes to, I guess, workplace well-being, Shao, what are some of the traditional approaches for workplace well-being, and how scientific, effective, and sustainable are these traditional approaches?
Yeah, so many workplaces, when they first start to invest in wellbeing, think about providing training, tools, support for their people at an individual level, right? Well, wellbeing does happen within each of us, and so often that seems the most logical place to start. We'll put on some workshops, we might provide some resources, perhaps we're even introducing coaching, although I'd say that's less traditional. It's something we're seeing more of recently as workplaces understand that it's not one and done. I can't just sit in one workshop and suddenly have wellbeing and resilience. I'm going to need space to practice that. Exactly. Haven't figured that one out yet, Ademus. We're going to need space to practice it in our real lives, and we're going to need some support and accountability as we try to apply that. And traditionally, we see all sorts of studies from people like Sean Aker and his wonderful work at Good Think, from Professor Tel Ben-Shahar and the work that he does through the Whole Being Institute and other programs. There are many different sources of evidence that suggest introducing those kind of wellbeing training programs, providing tools and some support, is likely, at least for some period, to have a positive impact on wellbeing. The question moving beyond the traditional really becomes, how do you sustain it? Because as we're touched on, it's not one and done, right? It's not a one workshop thing. And I think the other part we're only just starting to fully appreciate the challenge of in workplaces is that well-being is actually meant to ebb and flow over time. So when we introduce a well-being program or investment, absolutely, initially you are likely to see positive impact if that is an evidence-based program that's done in a thoughtful way for your context and has some ongoing support wrapped around it. But if we keep measuring well-being in that workplace, 6 months, 12 months, certainly by the time we get to about 18 months, 2 years later, chances are any gains you've seen in wellbeing might be dipping back. And if you hit something like COVID, it might dip back way faster than that, right? Now, it doesn't mean that what you invested in and the approaches that you tried didn't work. It actually means that your people are demonstrating very healthy responses for their well-being. If I was measuring well-being in your workplace and each year it kept trending up and up and up, I'd be a little bit worried that either people were lying in that measure or they become disconnected from reality, because eventually we have to be hitting perfect scores. And if anybody had perfect wellbeing scores for a sustained period of time, I would be very worried about their wellbeing, right? Our wellbeing is meant to ebb and flow because, again, it's our body and our brain's way of letting us know what's working well, where we're struggling, and what needs a bit of adapting. And of course, Ademus, as we know from the science, we are wired to adapt. So often what we see is a wellbeing practice like counting your blessings at the end of each day, probably one of the best researched interventions we can do for our wellbeing, replicated a lot of times in different contexts. But for many of us, if you do that intervention for a period of time, you will get to a point where it's like, if I have to write down my blessings for one more day, I'm going to poke myself in the eye with a pencil, right? We tend to get bored of things. Our brain loves novelty. We are wired to adapt in order to create space for the next challenge and the next learning and growth to occur. And so this means that, you know, what we're starting to see more appreciation of in workplaces that have been doing this for a while is that while that traditional place can be a great way to start, actually sustaining people's ability to care for well-being in a workplace needs a more intelligent and systemic approach. And so we see now more workplaces that have been at this for a while thinking about, well, how are we going to care for wellbeing across teams? How are we going to care for wellbeing across our whole organisation? And how are we going to account for the ebbs and flows to know that what we're doing is actually working when this kind of looks different from many of the things we measure in workplaces where our goal is to get this constant upward trend. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Again, there is another very useful tips and insights when it comes to designing interventions for any type of workplace well-being. Just having the acknowledgements, well-being ebbs and flows, I guess it, again, give people permissions to experience the struggles to be real, but also give people permissions, rooms to adapt and to grow, as you mentioned earlier, rather than having this expectation that what's called well-being always have to be ups and trending ups. Very good. Okay. So I know that you've done a lot of research in the areas of positive psychology and leadership. So what does the positive psychology research and neuroscience research teach us about workplace well-being, Michelle?
Yeah, I think there again is such a wealth of different practices that we can experiment with coming out of positive psychology and neuroscience. I think the most important part of all those different evidence-based approaches is to understand that even the very best research on human behaviour only tells us what works for some of the people some of the time, as Dr. Peggy Kern always likes to remind me. And so I think, again, it comes back to this appreciation that context matters when it comes to caring for our well-being. And part of that context is what is happening for each of us, what matters to us, what's meaningful for us, what are we resourced to be able to do within ourselves and within the environment in which we're in, and what does success actually look like for us. And so well-being is a very personal journey, and we need to be giving people permission to be able to draw from the science. I always say use the science to accelerate your understanding and inspire your practice, and then know that you've got full permission to pull the science apart and figure out what works best for you in your world for the outcomes that you want. I think part of that then, Adimus, like if we look across all those different interventions from counting your blessings to practice gratitude, you know, probably of all the wellbeing interventions, we know that gratitude is one of the most powerful practices for any of us when it comes to caring for our wellbeing. I love our colleague Caroline Adams-Miller talks about the importance of having a jolt of joy every day, and Professor Barbara Fredrickson leaning into that talks about our need to prioritize heartfelt positivity, to not wait until we're not so busy or we finish that project or, you know, we get over, you know, whatever this current stress is, but to make space for that. We know the importance, as you talk about so beautifully, of leveraging our strengths, those neurological superpowers we each have, to feel more engaged in life. We know how important relationships are to our overall well-being more than anything else. We know when it comes to our well-being from the research, it's often our relationships that matter the most. We know, to the point you were mentioning before, that need for self-compassion in order to be able to accomplish the things that matter to us, to have a sense of meaning and purpose in what we're doing, even the tedious, boring things where we can, and to care for our physical health. So again, I think there's no shortage of evidence-based practices. The piece that I think we're only just starting to understand more is our ability to choose which practice, at what times, how often, and how do we sustain it, is really a new area, again, that we've started to see emerging more and more in this research that Dr. Peggy Kern and I have been doing all over the world. And so we've discovered that you could have a toolbox of all sorts of different evidence-based practices from positive psychology and neuroscience to do any of those things we just talked about. And what you need overarching that toolbox is really the ability to be an intelligent and active steward of your well-being. And we're finding that there are 3 factors in particular that allow us to amplify our ability to care for our well-being. And we use that word amplify quite intentionally because the factors I'm about to give you start with AMP. So you can think about, how am I going to get bigger at it? So the first is the ability, right? We need the knowledge and the tools and the opportunities to actually be able to care for our well-being. So that's that toolbox of all the goodies. We need motivation and we need it
Mm.
consistently, because it's not, I did it one day, I'm all good. It's that I've got to do it every day, and I've probably got to do little bits throughout my day. And we know motivation also tends to ebb and flow, even for the most self-regulated and self-disciplined of us. And so we need to keep finding what's meaningful for me in this moment when it comes to caring for my well-being, if we're going to sustain the energy and commitment to keep reaching into that toolbox for the different things that we can use. And the third one is psychological safety. And this is probably that newer piece really starting to come into play, that caring for our well-being is not a solo adventure. We need safe spaces with other people, whether they're at home or at work or a coach or a mentor, to be able to talk about, when it comes to caring for our well-being, what's working well, because we want to know those so we can keep building on them. Where am I struggling? And we need safe spaces to be able to talk about that so that we can adapt. And most importantly, what am I learning about caring for my well-being, so that intelligence piece continues to grow for us as we continue to adjust and keep trying new things as our situation and our desired outcomes keep shifting. So those amplifiers really are what we're learning is so important. So the ability, the motivation, the psychological safety to be that intelligent and active steward of our well-being.
What a great acronym there. Thanks you, Shell. As you were talking about science and having the permission to put it all apart, suddenly it just brings me back to memory. A few years back, my son, I think that he was about perhaps 5 or 6, and at that point of time, he loves Lego. And of course, Lego means that you always come with a manual, and then you just step by step do it meticulously until you complete the design as the manual said it is. So he built many different types of Legos with airplanes and trains and cars and all sort of things as well. And then one day when I came back from home, to my shock, I realized that he had not only pulled apart all the different pieces of Lego, but also mixed them all together into one big box. And obviously, being a dad, I was, somewhat furious. Maybe it's an understatement. I said, "What have you done?"
Whether it is, you can tell us.
That's right. I said, I don't know how we able to actually to so-called sort them out again, and then build it according to the original design. But then he just told me that, no worries, Dada. He called me Dada. Right? And then he just showed me another wonderful creations of his, not according to the manual, but still used the different parts and the shapes and the color of the Lego and created his own spacecraft. And it just hit home to me that, as you said, look, we can have all these so-called programs or intervention and activities, but at the end of the day, it's how we personalize it, put it into context, how much, when, to what extent, so that at the end of the day, again, how it can be sustainable and effective for us. So thank you for the reminder of using the AMP as an acronym.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Another question for you is that, how would you approach organizations who actually see workplace well-being as just a fad or a trend? That's something that's fluffy and cheesy. It's just a complete waste of money.
I often start by asking them if having electricity and internet connectivity for their workers is also a fad and a trend. Because, power and electricity, might help power the machines that are in their organization. And I think most organizations would say, no, I can't live without that. Wellbeing is what is powering the brains and the bodies of their people. And so can you really afford for the brains and the bodies of your people every day to not be showing up as fully as they have the opportunity to? And what is the cost of that versus the cost of the wellbeing program? There's such a wealth of research out there now that shows that workers with higher levels of wellbeing tend to have higher levels of engagement, so they're more present, less absent, less sick days, less injuries and the like. They tend to have higher levels of creativity and innovation. So when we think about one of the biggest competitive advantages that no competitor can steal from you, it is the creativity and innovation of your employees. They have better relationships with each other, but also with your clients and your suppliers. And I love the research of Cy Wakeman, who has found that on average, most employees leak about 2.5 hours a day when it comes to energy and productivity around relationship dramas at work. And she's gone through and quantified that into actual numbers. But I think, again, for most of us, if we think about where we lost the most energy this week, it's probably going to have something to do with other people in there at some point. And so when we look at those kind of bottom line outcomes that many organizations are working so hard to both monitor and improve: productivity, innovation, collaboration, all of that comes back to our well-being. When we are well within ourselves, when we feel safe, when we have energy to show up, when we're feeling like we can use our strengths, when we can manage our own stuff instead of projecting it out into our relationships with each other, all of that has a bottom line effect. And if they're still not sure, I do love the study that was done by Google right across their organization several years ago, when they tried to figure out what did their highest performing teams have in common across the organization. And one of the factors consistently in the mix was the levels of psychological safety. And so a big part of caring for our well-being and resilience, I mean, we talked about psychological safety as one of the amplifiers, but when I feel well within my body and my mind, I'm much better, one, at managing the things that might trigger me off unexpectedly and unhelpfully, but I'm also do much better at making safe spaces for other people to work alongside me. And so again, if we think about all the training programs being run around leadership, collaboration, having better relationships at work, customer service, probably the most common element, if you peel all of that back at the heart of those programs, is actually teaching people how to care for their own well-being and being resilient enough to be able to respond to different contexts without losing their stuff in the process.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that when it comes to workplace well-being, sometimes there's a concern that it's only for the global companies, only for the big companies. So what suggestions do you have for small business owners when it comes to thriving at their workplaces? Because they may think that I don't have the resources or the budgets as compared to the large companies.
Yeah, look, the good news is there is so much wonderful free research and tools and programs out there now that anyone can tap into regardless of the size of their organisation. For example, with Dr. Kern, we've made freely available our PERMA Wellbeing Survey for workplaces to use. So you can head to PERMA, PERMAH, survey.com and take that free survey yourself. It takes about 5 minutes. You can share it with your team to do it if you want. You get your results immediately. And if you want to, you can go ahead and create your own personal wellbeing plan that taps into a database of more than 200 different positive psychology and neuroscience interventions that you can use in a workplace. Some are less than 10 minutes, some are less than half an hour, some are more. You can choose what works in your world. And then even just sharing those reports or creating a safe space with your people, or just, it might just be the person at home if you're in a solo business by yourself, and using that same kind of learning experience we were talking about before with psychological safety of, okay, what's working well for me when it comes to my well-being? Where am I struggling? And so what am I learning? What might I want to try next there? And so again, wherever you can, just finding that safe space to have a bit of social support rather than making caring for your well-being a solo adventure. So Demas, costs nothing, could start right now, doesn't take more than 5 minutes to fill out the survey, less than 10 minutes a day to play with ways that you can support yourself, and have a chat with someone over dinner each night, even if you need to, or a friend, as you head home from the office, the person that you travel on the bus with regularly, whatever works for you, but just talk about it. Don't kind of lock it all in as a solo adventure.
And I guess that in a nutshell, again, it goes back to being deliberate, being intentional about our own well-being, rather than making once a year New Year resolutions. In the year 2020, I want to achieve this level of well-being. As I said, it is a process. It's a continuing, ongoing process, acknowledging the ebb and flow, making sure that we are tracking, if possible, measuring using evidence-based toolbox, as mentioned, and of course, surround ourselves again with people whom we're connected to as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's that point you're making so beautifully, that our well-being is a day-by-day, even moment-by-moment proposition. And the good news is that while part of that absolutely is determined by some of our genetic makeup and some of the circumstances in which we find ourselves, part of it also is absolutely influenced by the choices that we make each day. So that ability to amplify it. And we quite intentionally think about it as not always setting out to just improve our well-being. Remember, necessarily the goal isn't always up and up and up, but to just care for our well-being. I think sometimes we find, Adimas, the hardest part of, helping people like prioritize that is then they fear that, but I've got to look after everybody else first before I can look after me. And so just know that caring for your well-being, because it is a contagious factor among us in workplaces, is actually one of the most caring acts you can do for everybody else around you at work and at home. And so if you're struggling with this, going, yes, but Michelle, I'll get to it when I'm not so busy, when this project's done, when my team has settled down, just know that particularly if you're in a leadership role, you are the most contagious factor when it comes to your people's well-being quite often in a workplace. And so looking after you is actually one of the kindest and most effective ways you can help look after everybody else.
Thank you. One last question for you, Michelle. What is one thing that you have been doing this week to look after your well-being?
So for me, it's rest and renewal at the moment, kind of forced on me with COVID lockdowns. But here in Toronto, we're going into winter. We've had snow all week. During the summer, Adimas, I discovered the love of forest bathing. We've got a big deck. We're on the back of a ravine full of trees, and so I made good use of that deck to just sort of soak in the trees. Normally if I was in Australia, which is home for me most of the time, I'd be on the beach. I'm a big beach person, but I didn't have the beach, so I was like, we'll make use of the trees. Now winter's come and can't really forest bathe so easily. So Adimas, about 2 weeks ago, I bought a bubble. It's like a clear tent that's I put on the back deck. It's got a little heated blanket that I wrap myself up in like a little taco, and I can still forest bathe out there. Literally this week with the snow coming down, it was like being inside a snow globe. But it is my space for rest and renewal. And on the weekend, first thing on a Saturday morning, I will have about 2 to 3 hours with kids are, doing other things and having a lazy Saturday start, 2 to 3 hours in the bubble, with good music and journaling, sometimes napping, sometimes I'll read a book, but it's just my time for rest and renewal after a very busy week.
How creative. And imagining perhaps a hot coffee plus roast marshmallow as well.
hot cuppa. And I have figured out, but this is just between us, how to get the Uber to deliver cupcakes to the back of the bubble when I need it.
Exactly. Where's the entry point? Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Sugar to go with the well-being.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, I'm afraid that that's all the time that we have for today. Once again, really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And of course, if you want to engage Michelle's expertise, which is scientific, actionable, transferable, that's going to help you to improve your workplace well-being and your people to thrive, make sure you visit her website at michellemcquaid.com. I'll repeat that again. It's michellemcquaid.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Adimas from Strength Optimizer. We're here to bring out the best in you through optimizing your strengths. Have a wonderful and fabulous day, everyone. Goodbye. Thank you once again, Michelle.